listening to On Garden Design with Fleur and Sachi, who are two long-time friends and second career garden designers. What are we talking about today, Fleur?
Well, we are going to discuss difficult gardens today because, there's just everybody has a difficult section to their garden. Some people just have plain difficult gardens.
I know. As soon as you say difficult gardens, I feel like the garden itself is, trying to be difficult.
But that can happen too.
It can. But generally, I think the difficult garden is the result of, as you say, an environmental challenge that you have to overcome. And it might not be actually the environment. It might be that you put yourself in the environment and you're in a block of flats, for instance.
Yeah.
And therefore you have a challenge with your garden in any case.
Yes.
So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So I think of something that's topographically or environmentally complex or challenging.
Yes.
So like you say, it could be an urban area where you have a privacy issue or you have a lot of concrete around you or you just simply have no access to sun.
Yes.
Or you
too much access to sun.
Too much. That's right. Or, a real wind tunnel. Or it could be a, residential area that simply is very sloped or has a real drainage problem.
And it might not be your entire garden. It might actually just be that tricky corner or that, annoying place that you can never quite nail. That's also what we're talking about, isn't
absolutely. That really is. And I think this is a topic worth talking about because I would expect a lot of our listeners probably have some part of their garden that falls into this.
So which part of your garden falls into this?
You know what? There's a part of my garden that I find nothing really grows well. And it's not that it's necessarily dry shade. I think the soils are wrong. I think the drainage is bad. It doesn't get good flow and airflow, and I just think that's my challenge.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting because mine is a dry shade problem. And that's where, I consistently put stuff in that people tout as, really hardy and, can cope with all this and then they die.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm kind of giving up, really.
Yeah, and that's where I think our conversation will be quite useful because, my approach to my difficult space is just to try different plants.
Yes, same.
And yours the same. And I think, actually, have I got to the point where I should be thinking of something else?
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe it's just not meant to be planted.
Maybe it is just to basically treat it like a bit of rock.
Yeah, I think it needs to be like a stumpery or a
that's right.
or a rockery.
Or a cemetery.
Maybe a cemetery.
A plant cemetery.
Maybe it needs to be a sculpture garden.
Yes, maybe. Or maybe it just needs to be a bench or something that you sit on. Anyway, let's just quickly, what are the things that we've identified that we think would be best to talk about here?
Yeah.
Because I think there are some things that are pretty common across gardens.
Yeah, I reckon the first one's going to be slope.
Yeah, absolutely. Steepness.
Yeah, steepness and difficult slope. I mean, slope can be such an advantage for a design. It can make your design so interesting, but it always comes with challenges, including budgetary challenges.
I was about to say cost.
There's nothing cheap about working on slope.
No, not at all. And I would say these are probably some of the most expensive gardens to do if you're not doing a whole lot of hardscaping like a pool, etc. Because doing a pool on a slope, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And what else?
I think rooftop gardens and in that probably balconies as well.
Yes,
because of high exposure.
Challenges, yeah.
Light wells and thinking of also in that one is sort of vertical gardens. Vertical
gardens would be a good one because I think people look at them and think they're easy.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of challenges with vertical gardens.
Certainly. I'd say in a sort of built-up area, privacy is probably a significant challenge for many people.
Nothing worse than looking at your neighbour's washing line with their jocks hanging there. Speaking from experience.
Oh, dear.
That's right. I fixed that now, I'd just like to say.
Oh, good.
Actually, the plants fixed it for me.
Oh, good. Well done. Well done.
And what about the last one?
Well, I'd say, those awkward little corners that people have. And if you had a 90-degree corner at the end of your garden, that's okay. You can work with that. But when it's an acute angle and it's sort of, there's not much you can do with it. You can't access it easily and you can't put a structure in it and it's all kind of wrong. So pokey or acute corners, narrow little corners. And then probably the last one is also some of the legal issues like easements.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, easements are a good one to do as well. Although the rules will probably change depending where you are.
Yeah, it's just good to be aware of them,
yeah,
I think.
That's right. And what kind of things you want to be considering around easements. That's a good idea. So let's start with slope, shall we?
Let's start with slope.
That is my current challenge.
Well, why don't you start with talking about the garden you're working on at the moment, you're designing, because that is really difficult one.
It is. Look, it's not super difficult. I'm not on the edge of a cliff or anything, but it does have a significant drop, this garden. So it from back to front, there is a over 4 metre fall. And I guess the other challenge is that the house actually takes up most of the block. So there's not a lot of space on either side or out the front. So there's almost you've just got to get a pathway in around the house. What do you think about when you deal with a really steep block like that?
Yeah, my first thought is, where can I find level spaces?
Yep.
Because, if you don't have level areas, then the functionality of the whole space is really limited.
Yeah, I
So
agree
are you
with that.
finding you've got enough space that you can actually build some terraces that are sizable enough to be able to put something useful there, even just a bench seat or a nice planted out area or like a little water feature or sculpture, something that's good on a flat space?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that like a couple of areas that I've been able to do that. But what I'm actually resorting to, because these people also want a productive garden, is using some planters so that for their productive gardens, so that I can actually level the top of those while having a bit of slope at the bottom.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yes, I can see building that into the slope.
Building it into the slope.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
and that's
right.
quite clever with things like using like vegetable and herb gardens where you don't want them to be too big.
No,
you
that's right.
And you need to be able to
They need to be accessible.
Yes, accessible. And that's a good way to use a slope because you can quite easily build, it's like sleeper beds in on the slope. And
That's right. And you can actually you can level the bed as opposed to the rest of the block around it necessarily. But I think the thing that probably is most important to think about when you are dealing with a lot of steepness, as we said, the cost. Because the last thing you want is to put in a paving, like a path around your house that over time just migrates towards the bottom of the slope because you haven't actually spent the money you needed to concrete something in and really provide those foundations so it sticks to the foundation land.
It's so true. Like, I mean, there's so few materials that you can use on a slope that can actually just stay put.
Yes.
And I know there's sort of, techniques like you can use the hexagonal mesh.
I've never seen it really work very well.
You always see bits of it sticking out.
That's
it depends
right.
on how steep the slope is. It can really hold in pebble.
It can.
But
there's a point where the threshold is passed, I think.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work anymore. So you've got to know what you're doing on a slope, I think is probably the key there.
Yeah. It really is tricky and so that's where the cost comes in because it does take a level of engineering. It does take proper retaining. You need the in our country, Australian standards to be adhered to with drainage and the thickness of the wall and the materials that you're being used and how high.
Structurally sound and safe as well.
Yeah.
Because I'm actually doing another garden at the same time and they have a couple of retaining walls because they're not on such a slope, but they do have significant drop on their block as well. And there's some old retaining walls and they now have this fabulous lean forward as opposed to backwards because they were never stably put in. And so you've got this challenge then where the land has started to move and push the wall away. Yeah. And you don't want to end up spending even more money down the track because you didn't quite do it right the first time.
So true. Yeah, really tricky. I find if I've got quite a bit of a slope and I've got a bit of space, one thing that I do tend to do is I'll try and I'll build in a slight slope that the eye can't really register. So between the end of one terrace the base of a retaining wall and the beginning of the top of the next retaining wall, I'll try and put in like about a 2 to 3% slope so I can kind of gain some elevation change without it being obvious.
Yes.
And it's just enough for, your eye doesn't really register it, the mulch doesn't slide off, but you are just trying to get whatever space you can so that your next retaining wall doesn't have to be so high.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good way of doing things as well. And working with the contours of the land where you can so that you're not working against the slope as much if you've got that option. So, if you're terracing, following what you can rather than doing lots of cut and fill instead of trying to be as sympathetic as you can, again, also helps with cost.
Yeah, that's right.
You're able to do that.
Yeah.
But obviously it depends on your block and you don't necessarily have the opportunity to always do that.
Yeah. Just think about the planting choices with slope as well. You can really use plants to your benefit.
You can.
And first thing comes to mind is bank stabilising plants.
That's exactly what came to my mind as well. And so what are we talking about there? What are the kinds of plants that you would use to stabilise a slope?
Yeah, usually the ground covers. I find that they really do hold it in. There's a couple of great ones like Myporum parvifolium, which is an Australian native, and that's a really good one to sort of cling to the surface. I think some of the prostrate grevilleas are really good as well.
The ramblers, yes.
And now, see, I love the idea of putting trees in terraces because the root system really locks down the earth, but you've got to be careful about what trees you use.
You do. And in fact, I'm just thinking about the garden that we looked at that you were looking at recently in Brisbane, where they had put trees on a slope, but it really hadn't worked. Not so much for stabilisation. The stabilisation was fine, but the trees themselves didn't look very good.
Oh, yes. This is a series of. I actually said to the client, I said, "So how do you like opening your curtains every day and seeing your soldiers on parade?"
They did look like that. Absolutely.
And he looked at me and he said, "Oh my gosh, I've never seen them like that." And I said, "They're all lined up perfectly. There was on this really steep slope, and it was just a series of conifers, all exactly in parade formation." And he said, "Oh, I'm never going to look at them the same." And I'm like, well, I think we actually need to do something to make them less obvious because they just looked odd because the rest of the surroundings were really lovely native, kind of a lot of gum, a lot of eucalyptus sort of woodland. And then you've got these probably about 20
it was a significant
conifers.
Area, absolutely. And they really were ramrod straight, sticking out of their little sort of patch on the dirt with nothing grounding them into that slope.
And
so
we
they probably did a good job about
stabilising the slope. And actually talked to Tim about it. I said, look, if we keep them there, then we've got the stabilisation of the slope. It's working. It's clearly survived a lot of big rain events. I said, but let's try and reduce their impact. So visually, let's look at bringing in some of the native ground covers and the spillers and maybe a few kind of clipped restringia and things that actually give it a little bit of layered effect because at the moment it's just so stark. Yes. I'll put a picture up to support this one.
Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe some of our listeners can give us some feedback and say what would they do to fix that slope.
That would be really interesting to hear. Yeah. So anything else on slope before we move on to our next challenging, difficult area?
Actually, one of the effects of terracing, so if you do have a slopey area, stand at the top or the bottom of that slope and your eye just shoots straight down that slope. But if you have terracing and particularly changes of direction, so your stairs go down one part of the terrace, then they go along and they go down another part of the terrace, what it does is actually changes your focus. So your visual, your eye line, the line of sight meanders down the terrace and along the terrace, and it's so much more pleasant. It stops you from just shooting straight to the bottom.
That's really true.
Like if you were to fall down one of those stairs, you don't end up at the very bottom.
Yes, you end up on the side and then you go down.
That's right. And also I think the other thing that you can do well with dealing with slope and particularly sort of terracing is not making every terrace the same height. So if you've got subtle level changes or subtle changes in how high your rockwork is and the size, the width of your terraces, that actually makes the garden feel more interesting as well.
Does. That's very true actually. And again, often that will happen if you're working with the natural slope of the land too, thinking about how you might, because not many steep slopes are uniform in the way they go down. So thinking about how you actually deal with that, in that way, that's a great idea.
That's kind of really where I think, we've got to look at slope where you say, okay, it can be a challenge, but it can actually be a real point of interest.
Yes.
So, yes, it's going to be a bit more expensive, but you can really do things to dress it up, to make it more interesting, to be engaging. As you go through this journey of different levels, have little pockets of seating spaces that just make you want to sit and pause.
Yes.
Pause and enjoy.
If you've got the space.
Pause and enjoy that fine budget that you've poured into.
That's what I was about to say. And I think underpinning it all is do it properly so that you don't end up having to pick up the pile at the bottom and replaster it back onto your slope down the track in a few years when all the rain and everything has moved it downwards.
Yeah. Actually, probably lighting as well. So night lighting is probably really important if you've got access on a sloped area.
For safety, if nothing else.
Safety, and then it gives that ambience and also moves the eye across the landscape as opposed to straight down it.
Yes, that's absolutely
that can be quite
true.
lovely.
I think we need to move on to the next one, which is probably our rooftops and balconies challenge.
Indeed.
So what's the first thing that comes to mind for you around the challenges here?
I think very much about environmental challenges in terms of wind and high exposure to sun.
Yes.
It's that intensity, that intense heat. If you ever stood on kind of a rooftop, you feel Exposed. And there's a kind of urban heat effect as well. There's always a lot of concrete because you're on a rooftop.
Yeah, and always a lot of wind.
Yeah.
Very rarely are you on a rooftop where there's not a lot of wind. The thing that comes to my mind is often how restricted you are in terms of weight as well and what you can put on to a balcony or a rooftop, because the last thing you want is it to collapse under you. So, again, this is one a bit like a slope. You need to be really conscious about how you engineer structurally so that you don't end up with a problem down the track. And that goes to drainage as well, because there's nothing worse than being watered by the balcony above you.
Oh, yeah, and those awful kind of brown, sludgy stains that come down from the top balcony. But there's a couple of ways we can get around that.
Yes.
And I've done a fair bit of work with balcony design. There's really terrific planters, lightweight planters that have reservoir systems built into them. Mm-hmm. So that tendency to overwater can be reduced. And it's catchment. And, in lightweight materials, and then filling the planter itself with a lot of, lightweight potting mix.
Like the perlite.
A lot of perlite, a lot of perlite. And also, once you've got a balcony planter, changing the soil and all that is quite a lot of hassle. So the lighter and less compact it gets, the longer lasting, I think.
Even those tricks, if you've got particularly big planters or particularly big urns, some kind of containers, building up what's at the bottom of them, because most plants won't go to the bottom of those containers, so in terms of their roots. So really thinking about how deep do you need to have the actual soil substrate to grow in, and have some lightweight materials underneath. So that they're not, and again, things like the containers that are not made, the fiberglass as opposed to the proper ceramic, which is really heavy in itself, because those containers in themselves can be really weighty. Yeah,
that's right. Now, and if you're lucky enough to be designing a rooftop or a balcony garden in conjunction with an architect, for example, because I've recently done one of those, and so we're able to really influence how the design of the architecture of the rooftop was done based on being able to get that planter depth. And so so the top of the building being fitted with a drainage cell system, and then you can actually elevate like decking. So you've already got, before you even get to what looks like surface level, you've already got a depth of maybe about 400 mil of soil.
Oh, that's a luxury, being able to work at that
early
stage.
It is such a luxury for a garden designer, because most of the time we find ourselves retrofitting or just trying to Band-Aid solutions. Fixing. So, that's just that fabulous opportunity if you've got that, to really think about how to get maximum soil depth, because the deeper the root system for your plants, the less fragile they'll be to high exposure.
And so how do you deal with high exposure? I mean, this is really about plant choices, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's about plant choices. And for any of our listeners who've just listened to Mediterranean Garden Design,
of course.
Many of those plants we listed in that episode are really suitable to these sort of balcony and high exposed, intense kind of heat.
Harsh climate. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and just harsh conditions.
Yes.
It might not necessarily be that hot, but it just might be really a lot of wind.
Drying wind.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, I really think there you can't be too precious about really delicate kind of flowering plants. It has to be strappy foliage and tough stuff, some of the grasses that are beautiful.
Succulents.
Yeah. And Australian native plants really tick a lot of these boxes. They do well in those
It often
situations.
comes back again to these plants that are designed for harsh conditions, so that the big fluffy leaves, the needle-like leaves, and then the leathery things as well, and then those really, cushiony leaves like the succulents. All of those things will lend themselves absolutely.
Do really well.
Yeah.
Probably just another point on particularly rooftops, I guess also balconies, is to be out in those places, you want to create a shelter. And that shelter is usually best achieved by a hardscape structure, so a built structure, because plants, you can't have big trees in a lot of these places. They're not going to be big canopies, so you really can't rely on the trees to do that job for you. And also climbing vines just don't do well up high. And so I think that's something I see fail a lot, is people try to put a climbing vine as a, deciduous shade structure. It doesn't work.
That is true. Although if you are in an environment where bougainvillea survives, it is probably the one that is the hardy thing that you can put in some really exposed environments. So that's something to think about. We can't put them in Canberra because they're frost tender.
Yeah.
So, I think that's right. And I was just thinking also about how for a balcony, because a balcony doesn't necessarily get the kind of sun exposure and the wind exposure that perhaps a rooftop garden gets, but it might not get any sun.
Yeah.
And it might actually be very cold and damp. So again, your plant choices are so critical that you're actually selecting things that can deal with damp or can deal with cold, that can deal with no sun.
Yeah.
All of those kind of challenges.
And also you kind of want things that look good all year round.
You do.
When you're in a really sort of small space like that.
Don't go for deciduous species or annuals even necessarily, unless you're going to change them all the time.
Yeah, and that's a lot of hard work. If you're talking balcony, you have to then, bring things up through a lift well.
If you've got a lift, if you've got stairs for other people.
That's right. So, you're bringing potting mix up and down, tools, it's a messy job. You've got to go in and out through your apartment.
That's
so
right.
So you really just want things that are going to be real performers that can last the test of time.
And that actually work for the environment in which you're finding yourself. So it might be that actually on your balcony, if you have no sun, you're thinking more about ferns. And you're thinking about some of the big-leafed shady things. One of the things you might be able to grow up there is hostas, which otherwise get eaten by snails because you're away from snails.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily, unless you're on a ground floor block, of course.
Maybe some camellias as well, some of the small ones.
That's right. Some of those kind of plants can work here.
Oh, well, look, we're very lucky because our coffees have just arrived.
Oh, they have too. How nice.
Oh, that's just what I needed. Thank you so much, Coffee Man. And in fact, we want to dedicate our coffees today to Margie. So thank you so much, Margie, for buying us a coffee on Ko-fi. And you bought one each for such nice. I really appreciate it.
We do indeed. And they are much needed right now just to keep our energy up while we move to vertical gardens and light wells.
Fantastic. So light wells are tricky spaces. So it's kind of like, when I think of a light well, I think of kind of like a glass house that sits in the middle of a building.
Yeah, so basically they are designed to bring light into a building where there is no outward-facing windows.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine that their exposure is sort of directly up. So there'll be a lot of times in the day where there's just not sunlight.
Yes, so they are like a skylight.
Yeah, just slightly bigger. And often people will want to put a planting zone at the base of them.
That's right.
And sometimes they're exposed to the air, so they'll have rainfall come in. But
Often
other times they might have like a glass kind of roof, like a glass house. So I think immediately when you think of those sort of environments, you think it's a captive garden. So,
and I immediately think of plastic plants. I don't know why? But probably because often people have tried to build a garden in those spaces, and they really it's hard to make them successful. Is my experience, and so they resort to putting plastic plants in with some nice substrate of shiny white pebbles or something to make it look like
it's a really good point because it's a really difficult space to do plantings. And that's probably why we're talking about it in our difficult garden section.
Right, because it is a deeply artificial environment.
Yeah. And what you'll find is most plants that would do really well in a garden, they are reaching to the sunlight, so they get all leggy underneath. So your eye level is just looking at leggy sticks, and then you get
or
plants,
lean because it's leaning towards a particular direction as well.
And then if you try to sort of densely plan it out, trying to make it look like a bit of a tropical paradise, often they're little festy breeding zones for a lot of pests and diseases.
That's exactly right, because it isn't a normal environment where you have lots of air circulation that help to manage that. Often also they're subjected then to the dry environment that is an artificial climate.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily very conducive to strong plant growth. And they, like a rooftop or balcony, you don't have a lot of regeneration going on in the soil, so that the soils can become very depleted quite quickly, and so the plants then start looking like they're suffering as well.
Yeah, it's a really tricky space.
They are a very tricky space. But what would you do
so
to
what do we
fix
do with
that?
that?
I would not have one. There you go.
Well, it's interesting. I sort of thinking this through, I find that some of the most successful light wells are kind of based on a bit of the restraint of a Japanese garden. And when I say restraint, I'm really thinking about how you do have a couple of, like one, say, real specimen tree, like a dwarf maple or something like that. It's just got beautiful form. There's a lot of pebble, rock and textured surfaces. And then you might have things very spaced out. So your plants aren't clustered, but they're spaced out in a beautiful way where things like the rock, the patina, maybe a water bowl can be the stars of the show rather than necessarily the plants.
I think you've nailed it, because for me it's all about how do you make the things that are not the plants feature a lot more, because they're the things that look like they'll stay looking good as opposed to the plant. And the other alternative from my perspective is you are refreshing plants pretty frequently. That's the other alternative.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and that's high maintenance.
It is high maintenance. It's a lot of work and it's expensive at the end of the day as well.
So I think that's a good one to really start to challenge yourself. So when you've got a complex space, you say, I have to shift my type of thinking. I have to sort of think outside the normal go-to, which is plants, and say, what other kind of materials, sculptures, accessories can I use that makes that space feel like a garden that doesn't necessarily have to be full of plants? And so in that, that's what I say, like a water feature might be a really good way to manage it. Mirrors. Some furniture is really attractive. Mm-hmm. Some furniture that's actually got, just some lovely cushion covers, and if you get a bit of colour with that, maybe a really nice series of sort of pots and urns, things that are sculptural. Maybe even this is where you use some mosaic tile and something that brings a bit of colour but it's really low maintenance.
And so the plants are really not the focus element in this design. And the kind of thing that comes immediately to my mind is something like a Zen garden, where it is a lot of the substrate is the feature, and you might have a really lovely boulder. And in fact, there's a really neat garden in one of the buildings in Canberra, and they actually kept some of the old paving from the previous building that was there, which was a bit historic, and they have built the garden so it's actually right on the edge of a window. It spills from inside to outside, and so the substrate is still there. They've got a few ground covers around it, but the majority of the plantings are actually outside where they flourish more, and they've been really minimal on the plantings inside, but they've got the same material outside as inside, and so there is this feeling that the outside is coming in.
Clever.
It is very clever.
Must have been a good designer.
Yes, must have been a good designer. Absolutely. So let's just quickly talk about the vertical gardens, because that was the other part of this, and I think they are just as challenging, and I think there are two vertical gardens that I have seen that look good and that have stayed looking good.
In Singapore?
No, but one of them is in the Qantas First Class Lounge in Sydney Airport, and you can tell there's a massive investment of effort in it.
Yeah.
And the other one is actually around the corner from me, which is a much lower maintenance garden. It's external. It is actually a vertical garden on the front of a house, but I have seen them changing out the plants. So there's clearly a lot of work, even though it doesn't look like there's a lot of work in it. Yeah.
Look, honestly, I agree with you. I haven't seen a vertical garden that's set and forget. A lot of people buy these sort of structures, they sort of whack up and they have little pockets in them, and you put your plant in there and you think you're just going to leave it. But really, you get sloppy stains down the back of the wall. Unless you've got a proper irrigation system and a proper setup.
That's right.
Which you've got to invest significant amount into having that set up, and then you've got to test water. And
you do.
It's really difficult.
They are.
Difficult. Now, all hats off to all the professionals who do this as a living, because they do it properly.
They do.
But for the average home gardener, this is a really difficult space to work in.
I would steer away unless you've got no other alternative, and this is something you want to pour some time and investment in. Yeah. I totally agree, because they really are, they're great for vertical limited space. You've got limited weeding that you have to do. They can be used to hide things. There's all sorts of positive things about them, but they are hard to make look good and work. And in fact, Jackie Warburton, who we've had on the show before, she is a succulent expert, and she has a vertical garden which she filled with succulents, and even she is struggling, and she's a serious horticulturist. So I think that tells you a lot about how hard it is to make these things work in general.
Certainly. And maybe that's why I said, sort of quipped about Singapore. Now, some countries have particularly good climates for the type of plants that stick to things.
Epiphytes, that's right.
And so, if you're in a sort of tropical place like that where the rainfall does it all and the plants are naturally climatised, then there you've got a good fighting chance.
Absolutely, but leave it for Singapore. That's my advice.
Yeah, indeed.
So what's the next one that we want to talk about?
Probably privacy.
That sounds good.
Yeah. And so really what I'm thinking about there is whether this is generally an urban kind of area, maybe residential, where you've got sort of parts of your house that overlook into someone else's garden or someone else's.
Their washing line, yes.
Yeah, things you don't want to see.
Compost.
Or, you just
coop.
want some privacy into your own house. All that sort of stuff. So
you like to get around with not much on. That's absolutely okay.
That's right. Like one of my clients, and she said, she really likes to go naked in a hot tub. And she said, I might just need to keep that tree so I can do the dash so the people from the apartments up there can't see me. I was like, that's a good idea. Or just, let it all out.
That's right.
Their problem for looking.
Or their good luck, whichever way you like to go. So what would you do? What's your general thinking around how you manage privacy?
So, I'm a real fan of doing pergolas with climbing vines.
Yes.
I really like that effect because it softens the light. It's quite beautiful. Often there's something that can be quite a quick solution and quite a, relatively inexpensive solution. That works quite well.
I'm similar like that, but mine is a hedge. So picking something that, is a relatively narrow, upright thing that you can manage, and then you don't have to deal with the structural build either. And it can be a relatively cheap way to build yourself some privacy.
It takes a while though. You need your hedge to get up that high.
It does. But you can choose a fast-growing hedge like you have around your house.
You know what the problem with those fast-growing hedges?
You have to prune them.
They don't stop growing.
Yes, I know.
I'm like, okay, you can stop now. You've reached the perfect eye height.
Yeah.
But no, they just keep going.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. They don't take instruction. That is very true.
I reckon my big go-to for these kind of things are the grafted standards, the trees. So, things like the liquid amber gumball, love that one. The catalpa bignonoides, which is so these are grafted onto 1.8 metre
so they're not actually going to grow a lot taller.
No, so they max out at about 3 by 3 metres, and they're kind of like a big umbrella, a living umbrella. And I have to say I use them quite a lot along kind of fence lines or narrow spaces because they don't rob you any space at the ground level, like out to the fence or whatever you're doing, but they give you a canopy.
Yes.
And they're perfectly situated so the top of the graft sits kind of at the top of the fence line. So then you've got the privacy up, a couple of metres wide and high.
Until they lose their leaves in winter.
Yeah, I don't have a solution for an evergreen one, except olives. Olives are probably, but then they drop olives.
That is true.
Yeah.
You get,
so if anyone's got it, I'd love to see a camellia that's grafted.
Yeah, I don't think they graft them, but you can certainly grow them as a standard.
I know,
but it
but
does, again, it takes a long time. Yeah, that is true. But that's why I find camellia hedges are a really useful evergreen screen, and mine has taken about 8 years to get to the point that I want it. But cypress hedges are another one. But again, you need to then really manage them as well. That's right.
Vigorous.
Exactly.
Right.
So what else can you do for privacy? The other one is a climber.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about over a pergola, but you could also actually grow a climber against a structure that is intended, like a trellis or something, that is just about the privacy and not, something overhead necessarily.
Actually, I've been using a lot of these recently for many
Rio.
gardens. Rio, you're going to, because it's like, I'm kind of like a big fan and it's really inexpensive.
What is Rio for people who don't
Rio.
know?
So Rio is, so it's like welded steel rods that are welded into a mesh kind of size, and they can be, like apertures of about 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres, and it's used to reinforce concrete.
Yeah,
that's
right.
what the actual purpose is.
It's reinforcing, which is why in Australia everything is acronymed. I meant shortened, abbreviated is what I meant, with an O on the end. Rio. There you go.
Yeah, that's it. So, and I find if you use them like as trellises, and you can actually fix them to things like just some
star pickets
with zip ties, things like that. Really easy DIY, and then you can put a climbing vine up those. It takes only maybe 10 centimetres of your ground space, as opposed to doing a hedge which might rob you of about 80 centimetres.
Yes, that's right.
So it's a really good way to do it.
Again,
narrow
it's
spaces.
a pruning intense potential. But very worth, and probably quicker as well than a hedge to grow. Yeah. I think we need to move on to the pokey acute angles.
Yes, let's do that. Okay, so pokey angles. Everyone has these little kind of weird bits in the backyard, don't they?
This is where, if you don't have a perfectly square block and you don't have right angles, I think most people are those, because blocks are just the weirdest shapes. I don't know what urban planners are doing, but they are creating weird shaped blocks.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what do you do with these ones?
Yeah, well, they're often kind of away from the house. So I'll look at things like, what's the sun path doing? Mm-hmm. So is it therefore going to be useful for something like a vegetable garden? Because vegetable gardens could be quite forgiving in terms of the shapes
you use.
You can have, odd shaped planters and arrange things in ways that you wouldn't necessarily have a garden space.
That's right.
So that could be an option. I also think another really great option if you happen to want chickens is you fence them off, because chickens don't care if they're living in an acute angle.
True. Yes.
They don't mind. And it's a way to create a straight line where you want the straight line to be, and then you hide it all the way.
That could go for bunnies or guinea pigs or whatever other
pet enclosures.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think, and also things like utility spaces, compost zones, that's my sort of go-to. What about you? Have you got any other ideas there?
For me, I actually think these spaces are ones that are often better hidden just by filling them with plants that might survive in them, but ignoring the fact that they're a weird shape, and actually with your garden creating a not weird shape out of it. Do you know what I mean? So you basically fill it up with plants, but then put whatever shape you want in front of it. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Explain.
So basically, you're just taking off the weird corner by putting a straight line in front of it.
That's exactly right. Yeah, or a curve, or whatever it might be, and you just fill it up, because then people don't actually see that there's a weird shape there.
Yeah,
and you're using your garden space in a way that makes more sense in terms of a layout and design.
Yeah. In fact, I did exactly that for a garden recently, where I actually brought a false fence forward. So a fence and a gate, and it made it look like that's actually the end of the garden.
Well, actually,
it neatens it off.
Behind it.
And then you go through and then behind it is just these pokey weird corners and spaces, and that's just for stacking those spare roof tiles. That's where the compost bin goes, all those kind of things.
Yes,
so it's just a really good way of just neatening up the garden.
That's right.
Yeah, and if you do things like you're tempted to try and make a little seating space, so you gotta ask yourself, am I really going to sit there?
That's right, because often
at the
they're
back
not.
of the shed,
but they're not very
cobwebby. It's where the snakes hang out.
That's
it's like,
right.
I'm probably not really going to use that. Shady, dank, full of weeds. Nah.
Yep. And in fact, you can also ask yourself, do I really need to do anything there, or do I just pretend it's not there, build something in front of it, and just carry the garden on from there?
Yeah.
Because often those places don't add a lot of value at all.
Yeah.
I reckon we're at the end, Fleur.
I think we are.
We have covered a lot of ground this time.
We have, and I think this has been such a good topic, because as garden designers, we get faced with these challenges because so many people have them.
They
so rest assured, you're not on your own.
That's right, and we're working hard to try and make it work for you.
Yeah, so really, if you have some difficult spaces, just know that a landscape designer can really help you out to just visualise that space differently and ask you all those questions that you know the answer to, but you don't want to admit to yourself.
And sometimes it can be useful to have someone quite independent ask you those questions rather than trying to work out what you're going to do, because in gardens, and when it's your own garden, you feel like you have to maximise every inch of it, and sometimes that's not actually the most practical way to go forward.
That's a great place to wrap up.
I think so. So if you want to follow us, that would be fantastic. It means more people can find us. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And we will see you again in another fortnight.
That's right. And we've got people from 78 countries listening to us.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Isn't that wonderful? So thank you, everybody, and send us in your words of support. We'd love to hear from you.
Or what you'd like to hear about next.
Right.
We'll talk to you soon.
Bye then.